Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me here.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you. Thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Paul Bloom, professor of psychology at Yale, author of a number of books: How Pleasure Works, Just Babies, just in the sense of morally just, not in the sense of being merely babies.
The title has a double meaning.
Like, in contrast to your current book, I might say, which is what we're here to talk about, which is being published even as we speak. I think we're going to post this on the very publication date. And this book is called... I hope people have enjoyed the part of this where they had a favorable view of you, Paul, because now I'm going to tell them what the title of the book is. It's called Against Empathy. It has, on the cover, picture of a heart encased in an ice cube. And I was curious, is this your actual heart? Do you actually literally have a heart of ice, Paul?
The good people at Echo went through every step. They had a surgeon come and they removed my heart from my chest and they put it into an ice cube and they photographed it.
It's funny.
That is my heart. My heart is encased in ice.
And it's Valentine shaped.
It is Valentine shaped. If we waited a while for the release of the book, we could have timed it perfectly.
That's great. So Against Empathy. This man is against empathy, folks. Now, I want to read a blurb. Daniel Gilbert, famous best-selling author and professor at Harvard, writes brilliant, powerful, and provocative. Against Empathy is sure to be one of the most controversial books of our time. This is all true. It really is a great book. It's one of those books that even if you don't fully agree at the end, you will be glad you read it because you've learned so much and had to think about so many things you hadn't thought about but should think about. I mean, just by way of illustration, our podcast listeners can't see this, but when I'm reading a book, every time I find something fascinating, I mark it and turn the page down. And I just want to like give you some sense for how many. I'm showing people how many pages are turned. I mean, I could have saved time by just turning down the pages that had nothing fascinating on them, right? So many of them are turned down. It really is a great book, Paul. Congratulations.
This has been a great discussion. We could end it now.
Well, good, because I don't have any more time. I've got to run. No, actually I don't. But I do think, the old joke in the publishing industry is that the weeks before publication is the calm before the calm. I think in this case you may actually get a storm.
Well, so I'll say two things about myself. So first is, as you may know, I'm not a naturally confrontational soul. I don't so a lot of these things which sound like prophecies are somewhat frightening. I love discussion and debate, but I'm not much for the whole heated yelling and so on. So you know me, I'm kind of affable. So I've been getting comments on the book and on ideas for a while, and a lot of them have been great, critical, smart, and going back and forth. And I love that sort of thing. But I don't want a heated discussion. The second thing is that, so here's the book again. Anybody who knows me, I actually suffer from an abundance of empathy. This book is in some sense a sort of self-help book for myself, which is, I naturally, I tear up at things. I get really upset when I hear stories about people suffering. My charitable contributions are bizarre based on personal prejudices and strong feelings. And a lot of this book is, this is not an unempathic person sort of trying to spread the word.
So this book is a cry for help in a certain sense.
This is definitely a cry for help.
Where can they send their money to help you, Paul?
They can send their money to Amazon.com.
Yeah.
And it's also coming out near Christmas, I'll remind you. So even if you think the book is stupid, it makes for an excellent ironic Christmas gift.
Yeah, it's either this or Against Jesus, I guess, for Christmas, for your Christmas list. So I would think that the temptation, if you write a book called Against Empathy, is when you meet someone who has only heard the title and you start talking about it, I would think the temptation is to say, now don't get the wrong idea, as you kind of just did, because you kind of said you're a nice guy, but you haven't said this book is not pro-genocide, for example, which it is not. I can attest. And you haven't said all the other things you might say to put people's mind at ease.
So to some extent,
subtitle kind of says
on the cover,
the case for rational compassion.
Exactly.
That's the subtitle.
So the subtitle, which Denise Oswald, my wonderful editor, thought up, is exactly sort of saying, look, I'm against something, but I'm not. This is not one of those weird pro-psychopathy books that we should be cruel to each other. It's not some sort of plea for selfishness or brutality. It's rather, if you want to be a good person, there's a better way to do it. And so part of the problem I always run into in this book, and whenever I talk about the book, I sort of have to begin in the worst possible way by explaining my terms, is some people think empathy is just a catch-all term for everything good. Being kind, being moral, being compassionate, or understanding. And I have no problem people want to use the word that way, and in that case, I'm not against empathy. I mean it in a more narrow sense, roughly putting yourself in the shoes of other people, feeling their pain, feeling their suffering. And even taking that into account, I'm not against empathy for all realms of life. I think it's a wonderful source of pleasure. But the argument I make, which is still remains somewhat controversial, is that this narrow type of empathy is a very bad moral guide. It makes us into worse people. It makes the world worse.
Okay, so maybe you could. So you've kind of said that empathy is not. I mean, I think later we'll get into some of the distinctions, like between empathy and compassion, and also between a distinction you make between emotional empathy, feeling their pain, and cognitive empathy, just understanding what the world looks like to them. That you're not railing against. But just with what you've said about empathy, why don't you give us some examples of the damage empathy can do?
So I'll give two examples. One is empathy sets our priorities in a weird way. It is because of empathy that we care more about a little girl stuck in a well than we do about the crisis of climate change or global terrorism or anything statistical and future-oriented. Empathy zooms us in on particular concerns, often very real and significant concerns, but it causes us to blow them out of proportion. Worse, what it could sometimes do is cause us to address problems in ways that make the world worse. So one example I give a hypothetical example, is that if a little girl dies from a vaccine, or gets very sick from a vaccine, we'll often shut down the vaccine program. Even if a dozen girls are saved each year, a dozen people are saved each year by it, because you could feel the suffering of the girl, of her family. But the statistical abstraction that there are people who would have died but didn't leaves us cold. And we can talk about some real world examples like that. So one problem of empathy is it misdirects our action. Another problem of empathy is it's used as a tool for violence and aggression. So for every atrocity, every poorly thought out war, people use empathy as a way to elicit aggression. I mean, we inevitably, for any discussion, sooner or later we have to discuss Trump. And Trump may or may not be an empathic man, but he is certainly adroit at using the empathy of others. And in fact, a lot of his attacks on immigration, and particularly in Ann Coulter's book, which motivated Trump's feelings on immigration, are actually not sort of nasty claims about immigrants per se. They're horrible stories of people raped or killed or assaulted by immigrants. And you read these stories and you feel terrible. And this terribleness, this empathy for these victims naturally translates into aggression. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when people think about empathy, they think about puppies and charity and helping out lost people and everything. I think about going to war. Mm-hmm. Because whenever you see a war, just or unjust, it's used as a tool. If we ever go to a full-scale war against ISIS, we're going to see more and more videos of people beheaded.
Okay, yeah. So there's a couple of different things there. One of them is it leads you to focus on an individual case and shower resources on it, and take resources away from things that are less concrete, but maybe involve more people, more suffering, maybe in the future. You mentioned the girl in the well. Our younger viewers may be too young to recall how much time was eaten up on CNN and other networks by a girl. I think her name was Jessica. I don't know, but she was in a well. I think it was West Texas. She was stuck in a well.
The Midlands, yeah.
Midland, where I used to live, actually. That's why I remember it. It just went on, and, they could communicate with her, and, somewhat predictably, I think they got her out, right?
They did.
I don't think, actually, all the attention showered on her globally facilitated the getting out, but...
No. It's just, to get somebody out of a well, you just got to take some patience and so on. But if you don't remember, if you're, too young for that, and I know your readers, your watchers trend very young.
We have the demographic most sought by advertisers.
Mostly millennials. You're
affluent and 22 years old, all of them.
So a 22-year-old might remember Natalie Holloway, attractive girl, lost, kidnapped, murdered in Aruba. And that also captivated everybody's attention. During which time there was this ongoing slaughter in Africa, costing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And Paul Slovic, who is a psychologist who makes sense of these things, points out that network news didn't cover any of the Africa thing. They would endless wall-to-wall coverage of Natalie Holloway case. And I'm not denying the moral significance of baby Jessica's life or Natalie Holloway's life, but empathy throws everything out of proportion. And it's not just numerically out of proportion. I don't have many stories of people weeping over black girls or people who aren't American, because there are no such stories. Empathy is not only innumerate, it's also extraordinarily racially biased. You see this in the lab. You see all of these experiments involving watching a brain light up in empathic responses, and it's biased in every way you could imagine.
Okay, so this gets to one of the issues with empathy, which is that we do not bestow it equally on individuals. I mean, leaving aside the fact that focusing it too much on any one individual may be morally problematic from your point of view, there are findings about the kinds of people that we're likely to shower empathy on. It has to do partly with their relationship with us, right?
Yep. There's tons of findings. So some of them focus on the relationship. Were they kind to us in the past? Are they friends or foes? Some of the findings have to do with what we think of them morally. So one classic study looked at empathic responses to AIDS victims. And it turned out that if you were told that they got AIDS through an injection or through a blood transfusion, empathy flowed freely. But if you were told they got it through unprotected sex, it shut down. Mm-hmm. And then there's all this affiliation work. So one of the sort of Psych 101 findings that will always replicate is we care more about our group than for other groups. This is the bread and butter of so much of your theorizing and so much of your writing. So one cool illustration this is done in Europe, and I'm giving all the neuroscience of empathy studies because they're kind of a pretty direct measure, is they got these European soccer fans, and they got to witness the pain of somebody else. And when this other person was described as a fan of the same team, they had empathy. The same pain areas that would activate if they themselves were in pain lit up when they watched other ones in pain. If they were told that these guys were fans of the other team, not only did empathy drop, parts of the brain associated with pleasure light up. So, and from an objective point of view, you step back. So we also have the capacity to step back. To some extent, my book is about how smart we are. Because you could say, actually, 100 lives is worth more than one. Actually, a black girl matters as much as a white girl. Actually, soccer affiliation shouldn't matter. When you step back, you see how irrational our empathic responses are and how immoral.
Okay. So let's talk a little about, now let's get into the definition a little bit, because this does become important, because part of your contention that you're not a horrible person depends on your being pro-compassion,
yes,
while being anti-empathy.
Yes.
Now, for starters, do you run into people who say, I thought those two were the same thing?
I am busy right now responding to a critique of an article I wrote in Trends in Cognitive Science by a friend of mine, and a wonderful cognitive neuroscientist, who attacks me and says, they are one and the same. Why are you trying to pull them apart? And so I spent a lot in the book arguing that they can be pulled apart. They can be pulled apart every way you could imagine. They could be pulled apart in that. So my favorite studies here are done by this wonderful team: Tanya Singer, who's a neuroscientist, and Matthew Ricard, who you will know from your Buddhist meditation interest, who's a Buddhist monk and a biologist.
He's the happiest man in the world.
The happiest man in the world.
He's been called that.
When I get together with him, in the room, there's now the average person in the world. So, and I met him once, and amazing, very different from me. And so they did all these studies together where they train people to be empathic and, to feel other people's pain, to put yourself in their shoes. And they scan their brains as they do, and they look at things. And then they train another group of people. They say, just love other people. Just feel loving kindness, as you guys say. But don't feel their pain. And then what they find is different parts of the brain light up. And more importantly, it has different consequences. Empathy wears you out. It makes you avoidant. It's painful. It's unpleasant. When you're empathizing with a suffering person, you're suffering. That's awful. Compassion makes you productive, positive, cheers you up. And to me, I like this work because it's just the clearest illustration you could pull them apart. And I think so another alternative title for my book would be, clarifying different routes of moral action, pulling apart things that people blend together. Sometimes people think the immediate response I often get is, if you don't feel another person's pain, why would you want to help them? What would motivate you to help them? And it just takes a little while to realize, put aside the laboratory work, that there's all sorts of times where you want to help somebody without feeling their pain. If my child wakes up in the middle of the night with a screaming nightmare, and I go to see him, I don't feel his terror. I just want to calm down. I love him. Mm-hmm. If you're having an anxiety attack and you come to talk to me, I don't need to feel anxious. And we could also so you don't need empathy to be a good person.
So and the brain scans show a difference between when people are actually feeling the pain. Now, I assume in both of these cases they were told to think about like suffering people.
Yes.
Same suffering people. And I know Ricard himself, a very adept meditator, did this, right?
Yes.
Himself. And, I'm kind of not surprised that he can do it so readily, right? Like he can say, okay, now I'm going to feel true empathy, experience the pain that I see them experiencing. Now I'm just going to feel compassion, because really adept meditators are really good at very subtly shifting gears. But I'm a little surprised that the run of the mill. I mean, I think I might have trouble. I mean, I think what I'm kind of saying is I think the way empathy works is it's not generally something people decide to do. They see somebody suffering, they either feel it or they don't. But I should say, I mean, his brain scans did draw a clear distinction. So even leaving aside these lay people who I guess were also studied, he's a very interesting case. And he, in his conversations with you, he said, "Oh man, compassion's way better than empathy, right? In terms of its actual usefulness in doing good things."
So yeah, I met him years ago when I was just starting this project, and he's a very nice man. And we sat down for some tea, and he asked me what I was up to, and I felt embarrassed saying I'm writing a book against empathy. It felt like, I'm telling like a rabbi I'm writing a book against Shabbos, but he said, of course, empathy is terrible. Empathy is just this waste, it exhausts you and everything. Compassion is so much better. And he pointed me to Buddhist theology. There's a wonderful book by Charles Goodman, which carefully makes this distinction. Mm-hmm. Now I agree with you. Your average person, you can't just switch it back and forth. I mean, they did these experiments with Ricard before they did it with normal people, where they said, okay, feel empathy for a long time. And he did this, and they scanned his brain, and he got up, and then they said, do you want to continue? And he said, I really want to spend a bit of time feeling compassion. Do you mind? Because this was awful. And however, I think there are ways which we can become less empathic when we want to. There's some really cool work by David DeSteno and his colleagues, which find that different forms of meditation, like mindfulness meditation, might make you nicer, more compassionate. Today I think we should be cautious because there's a lot of claims that get overrun, and he's suitably cautious, but there's some good evidence, repeated study after it makes you nicer. And there's different explanations for why, but one explanation he's fond of is it shuts down the parts of your brain that are involved in empathy. Mm-hmm. So you're kinder because you're not upset by the suffering person. You don't want to avoid them. You don't want to, you can just love them and want to help them.
Okay, so Ricard is drawing a pretty clear distinction between the two, almost, a dichotomy.
Yeah.
I think some people introspectively might think that it's a little more of a continuum, and I think you kind of acknowledge in parts of the book that it is. And the place that it came to my attention in a way that bears on your argument was in, I think this was from Tanya Singer. She and another colleague, you have their definition of compassion, and they write, in contrast to empathy, compassion does not mean sharing the suffering of the other. Rather, it is characterized by feelings of warmth, concern, and care for the other, as well as, and I think this is the key part for my purposes, as well as a strong motivation to improve the other's well-being. Now, from your point of view, that is shared. That's the part of empathy that's kind of problematic, right? I mean, the strong motivation to improve the other's well-being it's the fact that sucks in all your resources, right? So it's the fact that I mean, there is just this kind of inherent tension between, on the one hand, feeling such strong motivation to help that you wind up not doing so in a very rational way, all things considered. And on the other hand, the fact that feeling something like that is almost a prerequisite for morally grounded intervention, right? I mean, but my main point is, even their definition of compassion has the dimension that in some ways, the dimension of empathy that in some ways bothers you.
Yeah, and I think that that's true. I think that in some way I would rank empathy and compassion, other moral faculties, on a continuum, and they're all subject to bias. They're just as I'm much more likely to feel empathy for somebody who looks like me and maybe is related to me than to a stranger, I'm probably more likely to feel compassion for that person. I mean, I'm not Matthew Ricard. I don't have this limitless loving kindness. The biases and narrowness and parochialism run right through our cognition, and I wouldn't doubt that for a second. I don't actually think we should use compassion for moral decision making either. I think the role compassion plays is you need some sort of motivation. So David Hume famously said, and I never think, there's never been a good response to this, and never been an argument against it, which I've been convincing, that it's not enough to reason your way through a conclusion. You need some sort of motivational kick in the pants. And so I think my sort of rational compassion is meant as two things. You should use rationality to figure out the right thing to do, and compassion is the kick in the pants that makes you do it. And I think compassion works better than empathy in that regard, but I don't deny that compassion is biased.
Okay. So the ideal person from your point of view, or the morally ideal person, at some point feels some motivation to help people.
Absolutely.
And then after that, it's all about rational calculation about how to help the most people. I mean, I kind of think of Peter Singer here.
Yep.
And I know him somewhat. And I've actually seen him express, I mean, he's a sensitive person. I remember a specific time when we were talking about somebody who had been kind of embarrassed. Actually, the name might be familiar to people, but it was a little bit of a public embarrassment. And Peter was more, I don't know if it was empathy or compassion, judging by what he said, but it was clearly he was sensitive. And yet, Peter is famous for being against these the Make-A-Wish Foundation, some things you talk about in the book, and he's a highly rational person in the way he allocates his kind of moral resources. So do you want us all to be like Peter Singer?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think that's in some way the perfect combination, which is Singer himself would say that pure rationality could motivate you to do good things. The arguments here get technical, but he actually thinks you could just do it all the way on rationality. I don't think that that's right. I think that one way to look at it is you want to make things a better place. You want to make the world better. You want to help people. That's a motivation. That's an emotion. But then you question, how do you do it? And then I think you should calculate cost-benefit calculations. A long time ago, even before I started thinking about this book, I was on a radio show, and we were talking about morality and so on. I was with a minister who was a very smart person. He's talking, and at one point, I just read this article in Slate about child beggars called "Don't Give to Child Beggars," and it said child beggars in India and Africa, when you give to them, you might make their lives better for a bit, but you're supporting this industry that enslaves and often maims children and makes the world worse. You should instead give to Oxfam or something. So in the course of this discussion, I say this, and she's very offended. And she says, I think that's horrible not to give. When I give, I have a special connection, this special feeling of intimacy and warmth, this humanness, she says. And I'm very slow on my feet, so I probably said something like, well, okay, I guess I'm got to think about that. But then, like days later, it occurred to me my response, which is, it depends what you want. If you want to feel really good, if you want to have a good buzz and a good satisfaction, by all means give to child beggars. Choose your charity based on what cheers you up most. Donate to multiple charities, you get multiple little twinges of happiness. But if you want to actually make the world a better place and help people, do something different.
Yeah.
And I think Peter Singer is a wonderful example of a person who's chose option B, who self-consciously and intelligently has said, I want to help people make the world better, and not just sort of get the satisfying buzz of empathy and other responses.
Right. And I mean, the presumption of the woman you were on the radio show with, and it is too bad you didn't have that comeback at the ready, I've got to say. It was good. The generic presumption is you can trust your feelings.
Yeah.
Right. And that the implications of that actually go beyond trusting empathy,
Yep.
from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, right? There's lots of ways to be led astray by following your feelings.
That's right. And I think, I've been thinking about alternative titles for my book. One idea was Empathy Schmempathy, but which was suggested. But another idea is don't listen to your heart. And empathy is just one case study. But I think you could go down the list. I've written before on disgust, which I think is a horrible moral guide. Mm-hmm. And I don't make the argument so much because I think most people already agree with me. But I could go down, say, for anger, for shame, for guilt. And this is because, as you have reminded us, maybe more than any other scholar, evolution has created these emotions for very different circumstances. And while they are adaptive in the evolutionary sense, in a moral sense or in an everyday sense in this modern world, they lead us astray. And so to some extent, what we need to do, because we're smart, is be at war with our evolutionary systems. This is what goes on in meditation. It goes on in conscious deliberation. I think one of the great things about people is we could say, this really feels like the right thing to do, but upon reflection, I realize that it's wrong.
Yeah, and I think we should feel lucky that natural selection did endow us with these various feelings that are not, strictly speaking, self-centered. I mean, whether it's empathy, compassion, whatever, all the kind of pro-social things. But at the same time, they're not designed to be deployed in a truly moral fashion. And if you deploy them unreflectively, you will not be the optimal moral person.
No, it's true, and I should qualify what I said then, which is true, which is that if evolution hadn't bequeathed us with some pro-social instincts to start with, we'd never get morality off the ground.
Right.
So to some extent, it's a bootstrapping process where these things initiate moral thought, and then we go back and we elaborate and we develop and we kick away some of the foundations once we're there. Mm-hmm. But if we were different creatures without the forces of kin selection, reciprocal altruism, we wouldn't be having, we wouldn't be around, but we wouldn't be having this moral discussion at all. Mm-hmm. So morality does rest on an evolved basis. It's just that so often we can transcend it. Okay. So it's evolution 101 that I love my kids more than I love your kids. But I also have the capacity to understand that from a certain sort of procedural system, the law shouldn't treat my kids differently from your kids. I'd be willing, if I was to be searching for an employee for the summer, in my laboratory, to abide by Yale regulations that says I can't employ my family. I acknowledge I have all these racial and gender and ethnicity biases and everything, but I also think that they're wrong and will work to circumvent them. Mm-hmm. And it's this duality which I think just fascinates me.
Mm-hmm. And you acknowledge in the book that, I mean, all of these things can be put to good use. You acknowledge in the book that you can come up with, kind of thought experiment examples where a dose of empathy would be better than nothing. But the argument that it is a particularly misleading emotion, I think, is very well made.
People often triumphantly say, well, here's a good thing empathy did. How do you deal with that smart guy? And my reaction is, I'm sure empathy does tons of good things. First thing, under certain circumstances, there's one person in trouble. You could help them. Helping them has no ill effects on the world, but help. Then if empathy pushes you to help them, it's a great thing. But in general, the fact that empathy has sort of motivated some good things isn't itself an argument for it, because racism could be used to motivate all sorts of good behaviors. I give the example in my book. Suppose there's a wonderful white candidate, a terrible black candidate, and it's really important. And so white Americans use a racist appeal to get people to vote for the white candidate. Well, now the world's a better place. We've elected a better person. Does this mean racism is a good idea? No. It means even a stop clock is right sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the various kinds of challenges people might make to your argument, we've kind of covered some. Another is wait a second, what about psychopaths? Aren't they people who lack empathy? And you have some interesting things and surprising things to say about psychopaths.
The literature is really interesting. I got into the literature, and it turns out that the literature on psychopaths is a bit of a mess because even people in the field use the term in a different way. And it often tends to be used even among psychologists and psychiatrists just to describe real bad people and whatever the badness is. But when you zoom in, so there's a classic psychopath test developed by this Canadian psychiatrist Hare, which is a list of criteria. You could go online and score yourself on the psychopath test. John Ronson once said that in his book on the psychopath test, said that if you're worried that you're a psychopath, you aren't. But if you're excited at the idea you might be a psychopath, maybe you are. Anyway, one of the items is lack of empathy. And it's true. Psychopaths score low in standard empathy tests. But what I describe in the book is people have studied what aspects of psychopathy actually lead to bad behavior. And it turns out empathy has no predictive power at all. What has huge predictive power is a history of violence, of course, and impulsivity and lack of self-control. Mm-hmm. And the same thing happens with the rest of us. So there's all of these studies. There's a big meta-analysis that looked at all of these empathy studies with prisoners, with college students, with normal people, with professors, with everything, looking at all different sorts of aggression, physical aggression, sexual aggression, verbal aggression. And the relation between low empathy and bad behavior is like zero. And I think what this goes to show is that there's other things going on in our morality, that a better judge of whether or not you're likely to rape or kill or help somebody, it's more to do with, do you want to make the world a better place? Can you control your base impulses? And so on. Mm-hmm. But whether or not you put yourself in people's shoes, surprisingly, I would have thought there'd be some effect. Surprisingly, is virtually irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other sense of putting yourself in their shoes, cognitive empathy. Yeah. I mean, you're skeptical, I think, of my claim that this is really the biggest single problem is the lack of cognitive empathy. But you're not against it in the way that you're against emotional empathy.
I am not. So cognitive empathy is understanding what's going on in other people's heads. And I guess my sense, and my views actually of talking with you have been changing a bit. I'm more in favor of cognitive empathy than I used to be. I've always thought of it as something which is perfectly amoral. It's a form of intelligence. In fact, sometimes psychologists call it social intelligence. So if you're a really good guy and you want to make the world a better place, cognitive empathy is a terrific tool. Because how are you going to help people if you don't know what they want? How are you going to get them to vote for you? How are you going to get them to do good things if you can't get in their head? You can't even buy a present for a child if you don't have cognitive empathy. You can't say a consoling word to a friend unless you know what'll make the friend happy. So it's a wonderful tool for good. But on the flip side, suppose you're a seducer or a con man or a psychopath or a torturer. Cognitive empathy is wonderful. You want to make me suffer? If you really know what makes me tick, what I'm most afraid of, what I'm most worried about, what I don't want to hear, you will be very good at making me suffer. So it's a tool for whatever end you want to use it for.
Right. And these are arguments you made when you and I talked about this publicly in New York a few months ago. And that caused me to refine my thinking. And I realized, I don't know how much of this I said at the time, my claim that a lack of cognitive empathy is kind of the biggest single problem in the world, I think there's two dimensions to it. The first, in response to what you said, it's true that, psychopaths can deploy cognitive empathy in destructive ways. Bad people like Hitler can deploy it in destructive ways. On the other hand, I kind of have a hunch that the bad people are already pretty good at it, right? And, I mean, if you do the experiment, like the thought experiment, wouldn't it, I mean, if you imagine a world with perfect cognitive empathy, well, then we would have known that the Munich Agreement wasn't going to work with Hitler or whatever, right? You would have seen inside his head. So I guess in cases where it's like zero-sum, somebody's trying to exploit somebody else or kill somebody else, my hunch is that if you just, maxed out on cognitive empathy globally, you would actually be somewhat correcting an imbalance. And, because I would guess that, victims are worse at it than victimizers. But that's just a hunch. The big thing I realized is my main claim is the main assumption behind my claim that a lack of cognitive empathy is the world's big problem is that there are a whole lot of, leave aside these kinds of zero-sum relationships, there's a whole lot of non-zero-sum games out there that don't get played successfully.
Yeah.
And that, especially on the international relations front, but in all kinds of ways, cases where both sides actually could be better off. But as anyone can tell you, in a situation like that, in solving a non-zero-sum game, a great, crippler of solutions to non-zero-sum games can be misreading signals and not understanding what the actual perspective of the other person, the actual interests of the other person are. So just, I'm clear on that now. I think it's because there are so many non-zero-sum games in the world that don't get played well that I'm big on cognitive empathy.
I agree with that. If I could turn a dial and increase the amount of cognitive empathy in the world, I do it in a second. Just as I turn the dial to increase the amount of intelligence in the world. Because, sure, there are evil people who would benefit from that. It'd be a shame to give a serial killer a 200 IQ and make him a masterful understanding of other people.
Right.
But on balance, I think, for one thing, most people, I think, are good. Most people want to make other people have compassion and kindness. And even putting that aside, a lot of our interactions are non-zero sum. So I could be not a particularly good person, but self-serving. But increased cognitive empathy will enable me to have interactions with other people that are a mutual benefit. Because I'm trying to increase my life, make things better, but I'm smart enough I'm now smart enough to understand that working for you in a proper way will benefit us both. So yeah, I really think, for the most part, the smarter the better, and that applies to social intelligence as well.
Okay. So now there's a line in your book, we touched a little on wars early on, but we didn't really get into it deeply. There's a line in your book that I think is relevant. It says, I will concede that empathy can serve as the brakes in certain cases, the brakes on bad things happening. But I will argue here that it is just as often the gas.
Yeah.
Just as often the fuel for bad stuff. What are some examples of that?
Well, I got into an interesting dialogue with British psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen.
Who's featured in the book pretty extensively because he's done a lot of work on empathy. And by the way, isn't he related to
Sacha Baron Cohen?
Yeah, the Borat and so on.
Borat,
right?
Yes. And I have a lot of respect for Simon. I mean, we find ourselves on opposite sides on these issues, and but he's been a very intelligent critic. And in response to an early article I wrote, he says, look, he gives the example of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a time of a Gaza conflict. And he said, if only each side had more empathy for the other, we wouldn't be in this mess. If, when launching bombs at the other place, you realize the suffering and have felt the suffering of the people and so on. And my response is, I actually think it's the opposite. I actually, when you look at when nations go to war, particularly when citizens are all behind it, there's too much empathy. So at the time, the Israelis were deeply moved by the kidnapping of some teenagers and murder of some Israeli teenagers. The Palestinians were tremendously moved by what they felt as horrific abuses of their people by the Israelis. Now, I think Baron-Cohen is right that if we could somehow feel the same empathy for the out-group as we do for the in-group, so that I love my enemy as I love myself, as I love my neighbor, then the world would be a better place. But that's not how the system works. When we put it down to the level of empathy or emotions in general, I'm going to care a lot more for my family and for my neighbors than for those people across the way who have tried to kill us so many times. Mm-hmm. So my claim, which is sort of the opposite of his, is that what the world needs for peace is not deeper feelings. It's more rationality and less deep feelings, because deep feelings are inevitably translated into violence against outgroups.
Well, in theory, if you could distribute deep feelings evenly,
yeah.
I mean, maybe that's a contradiction in terms, because if they're spread too diffusely, they can't be deep or something. But I mean, in theory, if you could make me equally likely to feel empathy for everyone, well, I guess you would still suffer from what you call the spotlight effect, which you've kind of alluded to, but we haven't used that term, which is like you're focused, whoever comes to your attention, if that is the recipient of your empathy, right away they start occupying a disproportionate place on your moral horizon because there's lots of other stuff going on in the world. But still, I'm kind of thinking that if you could allocate empathy
Yep.
universally, it wouldn't you wouldn't object to it as much.
An omniscient God could feel everybody's pain equally and could also feel the pain of future generations generated by hypothetical possibilities, could add it all together, and then could always do the right thing. But we are not such creatures. Not only is empathy biased in obvious ways, but innumeracy is a problem too. Suppose we're struggling what to do about, I don't know, laws on campus regarding sexual assault, regulations about that. Big debate on many campuses. What sort of rules should there be to protect somebody who claims to be a victim? What should be used to protect somebody who's been accused? And I think typically people just empathize with one or other. They sort of say, imagine what it'd be like to be a woman sexually assaulted, and your assaulter is let loose on campus. Imagine what it'd be like to be a man, a young freshman guy who is falsely accused. You have no right to protect yourself. And so we should empathize with both of them. Then who else? You're going to empathize with other freshmen who see the regulations, respond accordingly, to the community, to the parents. The problem with what you end up with is you end up, I think, appropriately abandoning empathy and just saying, well, let's look at the big picture. Let's try to sort of add up the pluses and minuses, apply universal principles, and so on. Empathy makes you stupid in that way. It zooms you in.
Right. It has more of that than compassion.
Yes. And compassion has its vulnerabilities. But you could feel compassion for a group of people. You could feel compassion for a community ravaged by a tsunami or something without ever imagining what it's like to be hit by one.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm wondering if we're trying to get people to imagine the difference between empathy and compassion, if it's a little like if I imagine my child getting injured as compared to watching some just child I don't know getting injured, that might capture a little of it, right? I mean, when my child gets injured, I really feel the pain. When another child gets injured, I'm sorry about it. And if it's horrific enough, I would, be, but kind of devastated. But I'm just wondering how many people have you done this? Have you tried to explain to people like here's the distinction in ways that they could start to kind of grok it?
So one way to try to generate a feeling for the distinction is a lot of people worry about climate change. And so some of, so here I'm speaking to sort of half of the audience who do, they worry about climate change. If you worry about climate change, why is that a problem? Well, it's people in the future generations, but there's no particular person you're imagining suffering from it. I mean, you could generate such a person as an imaginative fantasy, but you typically just say, well, millions, billions of people will suffer. If you don't like that example, failure to fund Social Security, rising deficits, international terrorism, these very serious big issues. Many people are honestly concerned about it because they worry the world will be worse. You can get all of that without feeling anybody's pain. Mm-hmm. And I guess another example is some of us give to all sorts of charities. And sometimes you hear, oh my gosh, there was an earthquake so-and-so. I'll give some money there, without ever really imagining what it's like to be in an earthquake. Mm-hmm. There was a tsunami a long time ago. That was a horrific tsunami. And I remember the time sending money online because I was just so moved by it. But I didn't imagine what it was like to be hit by a tsunami, not even for a second. Mm-hmm. I just said, that's awful. I don't want so many people to suffer. I'll try to do my bit to help. Yeah. So that's the sort of distinction.
Yeah. So in reading the book, I was trying to come up with like killer arguments against it. Of course, when you're reading a book called Against Empathy, something in you that wants to come up with killer arguments against a book called Against Empathy. And and it's a sign of its success that you can never quite, you're struggling trying to find a killer argument. You can never quite find it. You keep coming up with these things that set me back. But one kind of argument, and I'm sure you've heard them all, is like if you can imagine a situation where what's required to do the highly moral thing is not something as kind of casual and incremental as donating some money, but it's like you're going to join a crusade, and of course often crusades are misguided, but if it's something like, say, the institution of slavery, and you're going to become You may or may not become, you're a white person, say, and you may or may not become a crusading abolitionist. And there may be this one moment where you saw a slave being mistreated, and you felt something that was true empathy, and maybe compassion wouldn't have done the trick. So there's like a threshold effect, right?
That's a good argument. I've often worried about that. So it could be that empathy gives you more of a kick in the pants than compassion. Compassion is this very Buddhist, very relaxed, I want to make the world a better place. But empathy could hit you like anything, could transform you and push you. And it might be that certain good things that have happened in the world would not have happened if we weren't able to feel other people's pain. Mm-hmm. I concede that. I guess I would also inevitably add, and certain bad things that have happened in the world would not have happened if we didn't feel somebody's pain. Atrocity after atrocity is often generated by, you hear in the American South stories about white women being raped, and these generate so much action, moral action. Mm-hmm. These are not psychopaths. These are people who are trying to avenge a terrible wrong that has struck them in their heart. So empathy, I would agree. Empathy is moral jet fuel. Mm-hmm. But it could send you in all sorts of directions.
And of course, Donald Trump used the rapist. They're coming after our women, right? They're coming over the border after our women. That's a common thing. And wars. You talk a little about wars. I remember the first Iraq War. There was testimony at some congressional hearing before we went. And I should say, as wars go, that wasn't bad. It was like it was authorized by the Security Council. It didn't unleash a torrent of bad consequences, that at least in an obvious way, the way the second Iraq War did. But before it, when people were deciding whether to go to war, there was congressional testimony by I think some Iraqi woman or something, and the testimony was that people somehow associated with Saddam Hussein's regime had been like unplugging incubators in hospitals. Now it turned out it was just a total lie, and in fact the person testifying was actually like a PR person or something. I mean, it was just a complete fabrication. But that kind of thing, that is so consequential. And that's classic. I assume you say that's classic empathy. When you start describing individual babies like dying.
Yeah. And I remember that. I remember a Time magazine cover, which I think from the time, of an Iraqi woman with her nose cut off. Front cover. I remember reading in the New York Times, by writers I respect, stories of the brutalities of Saddam Hussein's sons
in the run-up to the second war. I can remember specific. Like I remember supposedly one of their sons. There was some guy who was flirting with his girlfriend. So you know what he supposedly did, and maybe he did. He had his goons hold the guy down and just pull out all his teeth. Yeah. Now there's some empathy for it. I'm like, ooh, I definitely don't want to be that guy. And
yes, and I remember other stories which I won't repeat here, and but it's funny that after all these years, that's what I remember.
Right, it is powerful.
And being human, and Adam Smith pointed this out. Adam Smith pointed out, when you have felt, I won't put it in his language, but when you put yourself in somebody's shoes or somebody's suffering, you are consumed with a desire to make those who make him suffer pay. And after reading these stories of Saddam Hussein and his monster sons, it made me feel like I just wish we could fly there and string them up. And this is a sincere feeling. I just think I think history shows it makes for very poor policy. Mm-hmm. And some of our and I think in general, this is criticism of empathy, but in general, just there's an expression like hard cases make for bad laws. And same thing for strong feelings. Strong feelings make for bad decisions.
Right.
And yeah.
So you're warning against a kind of a myopia and distortion that sets in by virtue of our so-called moral kind of impulses. And you're saying empathy is the biggest culprit of all. It's not that it's alone in this capacity, but it's the one that most focuses you on a single case. And perhaps even most, at least briefly, incapacitates your broader view and your rational capacities. So
it's a good question. I don't know. I kind of focus on empathy because I have this broader agenda, against trusting your feelings and in favor of rationality. And so empathy is a good target, because everyone loves empathy. So if I could cause you to question the value of empathy, then you'll agree to a broader program. I think in general, probably moral disgust, sexual disgust, it almost has a worse track record.
Yeah.
Because empathy can help people by accident. Disgust just makes things worse.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, you and I could talk about anger. So I once analogized empathy to anger. And the philosopher Jesse Prince, in a commentary, very smart commentary, says, I agree with you on empathy, you're wrong about anger. Anger is a good moral force. And, Jesse's a smart guy. He says sometimes you could get angry and beat somebody to death and kill your child and everything like that. It has its bad sides. But anger is a great force for moral revolutions. Mm-hmm. You look at the moral heroes we have, Martin Luther King and so on. These are often people who are generated by a righteous anger and not so much by empathy. And so, in some ways, a case-by-case basis. It may be, I know the Buddhists are really down on anger.
Yeah, they're not pro-anger.
No. There was this there's a book, I think it's coming out by Owen Flanagan, the philosopher, and he gets to meet with the Dalai Lama. So he gets to ask him one question. That's a great question. He said, would you have killed, if you could have done it, gone back through time, would you have killed Hitler? As he asked the Dalai Lama, so Dalai Lama talks to his, they translate and they go back, and the answer is, yes. I would have reluctantly killed Hitler to stop a bad karmic chain, but I would not have been angry at him.
Mm-hmm. Kill him with loving kindness.
Exactly.
Speaking of Buddhism, there's a line in your book that kind of reminded me of Buddhism. You're talking about the views of Elaine Scarry, a literary scholar, and it's something like she's recommending, don't try to make other people more morally weighty, make yourself less morally weighty, bring everyone down rather than bringing everyone up. Yeah. And that actually reminded me, I think it reminds me a little of some things you said when you read a book of mine that hasn't come out that's about Buddhism, but I think maybe you raised the question of is meditation, as you're describing its effects, necessarily going to make people on balance better people? I think the defense of it is largely about that meditation, especially in particular Buddhist traditions, is designed to, above all, dissolve the sense that you yourself is a special self. And if you get rid of that, then a lot of bad stuff goes away, right? I mean, the larger premise of Buddhism is that the things that make us suffer actually make us make other people suffer. That's the larger kind of claim, so that if you kind of work on yourself, it makes you a better person. But I do think that this particular idea that if you just become a less selfish, self-absorbed person, then you will find yourself attaching equal weight to every human being, which is kind of your moral ideal, right? So
I'll add. Your book is extraordinary, so I'm looking forward to a longer discussion of that. But here's my challenge for you. My challenge is that I agree with everything you're saying, which is the meditative practice of obliterating the idea that you're special, and all of your attachments and everything will make you, in tremendous a much better person. You're not going to wage war on people. You're not going to rape them. You're not going to kill them and everything like that. It'll take away all the bad stuff. My question is, where does it cause good stuff? Mm-hmm. So if I'm in this state where I recognize that of an impermanence of everything, so why am I going to run out and try to help people? Mm-hmm. And that I'm less sure of.
Well, I think that's a genuine challenge that Buddhism kind of faces. It's not a practical challenge because virtually no one goes so far down the path that it becomes an issue, right?
Yeah.
But it's true, the idea in the logical culmination of a certain kind of Buddhist thinking is that true enlightenment, in other words, the thing that none of us is actually maybe going to attain, nobody I know, but true enlightenment would involve not having preferences.
Yeah.
And that presumably would include moral preferences.
Yeah.
So I think that's a genuine theoretical challenge. On the other hand, it's not much of a practical challenge, since the number of people who arguably qualify as enlightened in the world, I could probably count on both hands. But moreover, even theoretically, if you imagine a world full of enlightened people, if you accomplish the whole Buddhist mission, well, you wouldn't have war, you wouldn't have murder or theft or exploitation, right? If nobody considered themselves their interests to have priority over other people's interests. So, problem solved.
There'll still be drowning children.
You think?
And the question of whether or not to wade in to help them. But you're right. There'll be less of that.
I mean, but the truth is, all the people I know who are closest to qualifying as, and I really, my research has led me to be in touch with some people who have meditated for thousands of hours. They clearly are in a totally different place than I am. Some of them may be able to make a claim to being enlightened in the Buddhist sense. All of them would, in fact, step in and save the drowning child.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing. What prevents you from saving a drowning child is fear of what happens to you. Well, that is radically diminished, in theory.
So there's a challenge which could be extended to both of us, which is in your work on Buddhism, you're sort of obliterating the idea of specialness of intimate relationships and so on. And I'm to some extent doing that in my anti-empathy book. So the question comes up, what about friends and family, parents and children? And so, for instance, I argue that empathy keeps us from being impartial. But I'm not Peter Singer. I don't think you should be impartial with regard to certain relations. I think not only am I closer to my children than I am to strangers, I think that that's right. I should be. I should feel loyalty to friends and to my wife and so on. And I have different answers to that. But the question of the role of empathy in these relationships does get a bit complicated. And this is actually something which I've changed my mind on. And I wonder if you see that as sort of a challenge to your own sort of proposals regarding the Buddhist lifestyle.
Kind of. I mean, as for myself, first of all, in any moral system, you have to take into account the costs of changing in certain ways.
Yeah.
And it's like the cost of becoming a person who doesn't love their own kids more than it's like, I don't know how you go about that. It would take a huge amount of effort and would probably, on balance, make me a worse person if I did it through normal paths. On the other hand, I have interviewed somebody who'd done so much meditation, and he actually said he had worked on dissolving his attachment to his own kids, and he did that only after they were self-sufficient, they were off on their own, they didn't need his help. And he said something that I suspect is true, and actually gets back to your book. When you talk about the costs of empathy, including the costs of being a highly empathic parent, he said, I think it made me a better parent. I can well imagine that is the case. I have seen lots of cases where there's too much empathy for the good of either the parent or the child.
Yeah, I have examples of that in my book. One example, which is actually a true example, is one of my sons a while ago came up to me very, very anxious about his schoolwork. And being him, he left at the last minute. It's come due tomorrow. He lost his backpack. He did that and that. And my feeling as a parent is for me to get anxious too, and sort of, oh my God, we're in big trouble and everything like that. That's not good parenting. It's not good friendship. It's not good parenting. The good parenting is say, it's for you to be calm. Yeah. And say, look, kid, let's take the big perspective. Let's go out for a walk for 10 minutes. I'll buy you an ice cream. We'll go back. We'll split up some time. I know you don't feel like it, but you got to do it. Right. And I think, it may be not the biggest ill in the world for parents, but high empathy is a good part of it. I'll add one thing against my view, though. I gave a talk a little while ago, and this came up, and I said, what you want in intimate relationships isn't empathy. What you want is your partner to understand you, the cognitive empathy, and care for you. But you don't want them to feel what you feel. And this is maybe one of the few times in academic talk where people shouted at me as I was talking, and they shouted, "You're wrong." And sketching it out, it turns out that some proportion of the population, and I might be married to one of them, thinks actually sometimes when you're angry, the person you love should feel your anger. And when you're
should feel your anger. I feel anger when my wife is angry, but it's not her anger I feel. That's not what you mean, right?
Well, that's not what I mean. So I don't mean, so when somebody I love is sad, I'll feel sad because I love them and I don't want to see them sad. But I'm talking about picking up their feelings as a mark of intimacy. And this philosopher, Michael Sloat, has a great example. You're a father, you have a daughter, your daughter does stamp collecting. So it's one thing to say, I respect you, that's great, that's a great hobby, I want to encourage it. But if you could share her excitement, share her enthusiasm, that's something special.
Mm-hmm.
And so I used to be, I'm more open to the idea that empathy plays some such role in close relationships.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, there's such thing as too much. And that's also true, as you note in the book, of doctor-patient relationships. You don't want a visibly empathic doctor.
Yes. Yes. And their terminology trips people up. So there's all these empathy training and empathy classes and so on. But what it typically comes down to is you're training the doctors to be polite and kind and listen and spend time with their patients. Everything good. But when it comes to real empathy, if I'm terrified about my diagnosis, I don't want to see my doctor cry. I want him to be calm.
Right.
I want him to be calm. I want him to treat me with respect. If we're close, I want him to feel sad if I'm in trouble. But I don't want him to feel what I feel. Then all of a sudden, I don't have one problem, I have two. Mm-hmm. And this is considerably more with therapists. Anybody who thinks that therapists should get depressed when dealing with depressed people has a very poor conception of therapy.
Okay, so final question is, you don't spend all that much time on this, but your whole argument is made from a particular philosophical standpoint, right? I mean, there are different philosophies. There are philosophies that posit certain virtues, and if I said, well, I'm a virtue ethicist, and I think the premier virtue is empathy, boom, there goes your argument. I win, right?
Yeah.
So what is your philosophical standpoint, just for the record?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'm kind of a lapsed utilitarian, but what's important is you don't have to be a utilitarian to sort of follow my argument. The way I try to structure the argument is say, look, here's a sort of situation where you have to figure out what to do. And empathy leans you in this way. But certainly upon reflection, you see that that's wrong. You shouldn't be saving the white girl over the black girl. You shouldn't be saving one instead of 100. And you can get to your moral view because you're a utilitarian, because you're a Kantian, because you're a whatever. But what I want to argue is basically empathy leads you to decisions that are morally wrong by just about any coherent moral theory. Now, I can imagine a certain virtue ethicist or some brands of, say, feminist philosophy and some where they would take issue with it. They'd say, look, empathy is itself a virtue. And the fact that it has bad consequences is of less interest to us. And I think those are sort of serious objections. But for the most part, I try to give examples where empathy just leads to things which are moral goofs by any account.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. So we're going to try to post this, I think, on publication date. We want to get in at the ground level, because this is going to be big, and I want to get in at the ground level and say I was there at creation against empathy. I think you're right. It's a great ironic Christmas present, and not so ironic. I mean, if it's about how to become a better person, that's totally Christmassy, right?
Give it to people you love and people you hate.
Right. And the subtitle, The Case for Rational Compassion, you might highlight that for people who, if you're going to give it as a Christmas gift. But it really is, it has your usual wit and grace of exposition. You have a great, you convey a great sensibility. I should tell you an anecdote, actually. The person probably wouldn't mind. The guy Guy Raz?
Of course.
He does this, he's been a public radio presence for a while, and he does this, he does the TED Radio Hour.
Wonderful interviewer. Yeah,
and he had interviewed me for a thing, and for somehow afterwards your name came up, and he said, "Oh, what a great guy! Isn't he? Does he just strike you as exactly the guy you want to become friends with?"
Oh,
wasn't that nice? And that's actually the sense you kind of get from your prose style, which is quite the feat when the book is called Against Empathy, right? Yeah. It's like, I want to become friends with this guy, seriously, and yet by the end of the book, I was willing.
Well, that's the kindest thing somebody said to me in a long time. Thank you.
Okay, well,
I'm at a loss for words.
Okay, so anyway, good luck with it. I think this is going to be big, baby.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care.